very much for taking the time to join. And I think we'll get going now because conscious of time, we're a couple of minutes in already. And thanks very much for everyone who's joined. We've got a lot of people on this webinar this morning. I'm joined by Luke Trill, Executive Director, More in Common UK. Normal format for these webinars where Luke will talk us through slides. For anyone joining for the first time, More in Common has been doing a series of these webinars over the campaign, during the campaign and before. They've been really well attended and hopefully very, very useful for people who take the time to come along. This is the first post-general election webinar from More in Common, and combined with analysis done by UCL Policy Lab as well. So, and incidentally, just a quick tease, there will be a full report next week and a mega poll, a new mega poll from More in Common next week as well, which will be much more analysis and data, and be able to really consider what the new electoral landscape looks like. So we're going to finish up, we've just got just under an hour with 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Please add your questions to the Q&A function the bottom of your screen. You can write your questions in there and we'll get to those. What we're going to cover today, well, what drove the result of the general election? What do the new electoral coalitions look like? The Gaza independence, the challenges for the new Labour government, and also where can the Conservative Party find the foundations to rebuild from? And without further ado, I'll hand over to Luke now. Luke, all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Angus. And thank you all for joining on this Monday morning. I'm pleased to see that you are not all electioned out, but instead are ready for even more analysis. As Angus says, this is kind of the first bite of the cherry for us based on a snap poll that we did as soon as polls closed, as well as some analysis of the results. We will have next week a fuller report with UCL Policy Lab, which will be based on an even bigger poll and will be a real sort of deep dive, as well as being sort of backward looking on the election a bit more as well on expectations for Labour in government and perhaps the future of the Conservative Party as well. But let us start with this webinar. Losing my train of thought there as I try and get it loaded up. So what happened? Well, I think the key thing to start with is to situate this election in recent elections we've seen. This was a change election. I think that is fairly undeniable, but it wasn't a traditional change election. It wasn't a 1997 very clear move from one administration to another. Instead, I think it is better to root this election along with the Brexit referendum in 2016, Boris Johnson's victory in 2019, and this election in 2024 has been about something deeper than simply a change from one government to the next, but rather expressing a broader and deeper dissatisfaction with the status quo. And I think the key thing which shows that is just how fragmented the electorate were. Smaller parties outside of the main two parties had a very good night on Thursday, excluding Scotland, which you might think of as reverting back to some of its traditional loyalties. Third parties did very well across the board. In fact, this was the lowest seat share for the main parties since 1923 and the lowest vote share almost in, well, certainly since proper democratic elections took place. So what we have seen is a splintering of the electorate. The electorate has splintered left, right, and centre. And you see that when you look at how vote share changed in seats held by particular parties. So what is really interesting is despite the fact that they enjoyed that big election win, on average, Labour lost votes in seats where they were the incumbent. Conservatives obviously lost votes in seats where they were the incumbent, and the SNP clearly lost votes in seats where they were the incumbent. The one exception to the rule, although it should be said they started with far fewer seats than the other parties, was the Liberal Democrats, where it was a bit of a mixed pattern. So I think it's fair to say that that demand for change, whilst primarily being directed at the Conservatives, was something deeper that went across the board. And if 2019 saw traditional loyalties fracturing, this election saw it even more so. The demand for change is about more than just the Conservatives. And you see that here when you look at where the 2019 vote went going to 2024. So you see that Conservative vote, just splitting so many different ways, going, yes, a big chunk to Reform UK, big chunk to Labour, but also to the Liberal Democrats and even the Greens. But also the Labour 2019 vote there, you see, smaller proportions, but it's still significant in an election where Labour moved from being in opposition to having a landslide majority. They were losing votes as well. So losing a big chunk to other parties, some to the Liberal Democrats. You might see that more as tactical sorting, and some to the Greens as well. And again, with the Lib Dems, you see that tactical sorting with Labour as well. Some Liberal Democrat voters going to Labour there. So that fragmentation was what allowed Labour to secure such a large victory on a lower vote share than the Conservatives had in 2019. Indeed, Labour actually got a lower number of absolute votes than they got themselves in 2019. So it's a kind of stark reminder that it's not just the number of votes you get, but the distribution of votes that you get that really matters. And I think, Labour campaign strategists can certainly give themselves a pat on the back, because their targeting clearly really paid off. And again, this slide reiterates that point. If you look here, this is all of the seats that Labour won. There is a big pattern there of Labour losing votes where it could afford to lose votes in some of those safer Labour seats, and then gaining vote share in the seats where they needed to, from the Conservatives, but also from the SNP as well. That obviously had great benefits in this election, but as Rob Ford identified in his excellent piece in yesterday's Observer, it means that Labour is sitting on a big but precarious majority, and it would take a swing of just 6% from Labour to the Conservatives for Labour to lose its majority. Although I think, if there's one thing we learned from this election, that the concept of sort of traditional uniform swing, which has been contested and not really matched reality for a while now, I think we can consign it to the dustbin of history. We have a much smarter, savvier electorate that isn't just going to go in one way. What do voters think about the result? Well, we asked people immediately afterwards, and we put this into a word cloud. The biggest word is happy, and then you get a tie between relieved and disappointed. And I think, another story of this election, I think, is that the electorate broadly got the result that they wanted, which is a big majority that can get things done. The Conservatives punished for the past 4 years in particular, and their failings both in terms of delivery but also stability. But also Labour MPs elected not on huge majorities, which sort of keeps them on notice, with the potential to boot them out at the next election should they want them to. So in general, I think the electorate gets what it wants at elections, and I think this election particularly so. So what does this mean for Britain's electoral geography. Well, there are a couple of ways to look at this. If we look at it in pure geographic terms, looking at England, where is the centre of gravity? Well, the average Labour gain from the Conservatives in terms of geography was Nuneaton in the Midlands. You can see it shows that their gains were fairly balanced around the country, which is why they end up somewhere in the middle of it. For the Conservatives, again, this is on geography rather than voter profile, it was Daventry, which is interesting because it shows that unlike in 1997, their average seat is somewhat further north than it was then. There is a very different profile to the Conservatives' geography now, centred around parts of the Midlands and not purely in the south. And for the Liberal Democrats, the furthest south of all of the parties, it is Newbury, which was their sort of average gain from the Conservatives. But the other way of looking at it is in terms of median seat. So, kind of looking at it by vote share. Well, for the Conservatives, that was Farnham and Borden in the south, which was targeted quite heavily by the Liberal Democrats. For Labour, it was Wakefield and Rothwell. That is a new seat, but of course, Wakefield was one of those red wall seats that fell in 2019, won back in a by-election. And for the Liberal Democrats, interestingly, also a by-election gain, Chesham and Amersham was their median seat in terms of vote share. So how do the parties keep these new electoral coalitions together? Well, let's firstly look a bit more. We've looked at the seats, but let's look a bit at the voter profile. Who is the typical 2024 Labour voter? And this is obviously an average. They have voters across different demographic groups, but it's quite interesting to look. So the average Labour voter is likely a 44-year-old man who went to university, would live in a city, and despite working full-time, is reasonably economically precarious. So that is the Labour voter. And if you look at what Labour's 2024 coalition looks like in terms of 2019 voters, a big chunk of it is people who voted for the party last time. They take a big chunk of Conservatives, so 1 in 5 of their 2024 voted Conservative at the last election. Some who didn't vote, some young people, and then a mix from the other parties. And you see Labour's very broad geographical spread on that map there. They are the only party, I think, which can truly claim to be a GB-wide party. Why did Labour succeed? Why did they win that election? Well, it is striking that when you ask people why they voted for the Labour Party, the NHS is right up there. In fact, it is far bigger than any of the other policy areas when you ask people personally, the economy next, and trusting them to represent their interests. Interestingly, it was only 1 in 5 who said they did it because they had only always voted for the party, and slightly fewer said it was tactical. When you ask the other question, though, which is, in general, why do you think Labour won so many seats in the election? It was that sense of change, that need for a fresh start, which is number one, followed by pledges to improve the NHS, and then for around 1 in 4 that they were the least awful of a bad bunch. But I think it is interesting. Obviously, there was a lot of discussion about the NHS during the campaign, but perhaps it was slightly underplayed, I think, in the pre-match analysis as to how much of a driver of votes it was. When you ask, as I'll go on to, why did, what was Rishi Sunak's biggest mistake? Failings on the NHS comes out top as well. And you have to wonder, had Sunak followed Dominic Cummings' advice and settled the NHS strikes on day one, whether we might be in a slightly different situation, or at least the scale of some of those defeats might have been minimised. Because what the Conservatives have been left with is a typical voter who is 65 years old, white, Christian, retired, tended not to go to university, although the educational split on Conservative voters is much narrower than it was at the last election, live in a small town, financially comfortable. And you can see there that, the Conservatives lost a significant amount, around half of their 2019 vote, but it was 2019 voters. It was loyal Conservative voters who still made up the overwhelming majority of their vote in this election. They did not make significant gains from other parties. And here you can see what is known as the crossover age. When did people flip from voting Labour to voting Conservative? That crossover age is now 62, up from 39 in 2019. And clearly, one of the things the Conservatives will be thinking about as they conduct their post-mortem is, how do we appeal to younger people? Because having the crossover age basically at retirement age does not bode well for the future of the party. And why did loyal Conservative voters stick with the party? Well, largely they trusted them to represent their interests, and then it was the economy, followed by immigration. Again, you ask people, why did the Conservatives lose so many seats? It was the NHS, immigration, and then the economy, which come out on top. So again, the NHS is undeniably a story of this election. And, I could have told you that from the many, many focus groups we would do, where the first thing people would want to talk about alongside the cost of living was the NHS. And everyone had a story of a family member who was struggling, was stuck on a waiting list, couldn't get an operation, had just had one pushed back. And in that way, I sort of compare it to Partygate, because the interesting thing about Partygate, and the reason that Partygate cut through so much, was everyone had a story about what they had sacrificed, whether it was a graduation, a wedding, a funeral, whilst people partied. The most powerful things in politics are things which cut through and people can relate to personally, and the NHS is very much there. So what about the Liberal Democrats? Liberal Democrats, very geographically concentrated, as you can see, winning back some of their West Country heartlands, but also, really jumps out to me is that total dominance almost in Oxfordshire. Oxfordshire, former Conservative heartland. Now the Conservatives wiped out, the Liberal Democrats having every seat, I think, apart from Banbury, which is Labour, and Oxford East, which is Labour too. So, this was not simply the Liberal Democrats recreating their pre-coalition era coalition. There are areas that they have gained which are new. In some parts of the West Country, Cornwall in particular, actually Labour gaining seats, which were formerly Liberal Democrat. And look at that vote share of Liberal Democrat voters. It is almost as many 29 Conservatives as it is 2019 Liberal Democrats, but also, 10% voted Labour. Again, that was that tactical sorting, which was so devastating. And it is really interesting that when you repeat that exercise of asking people, why did you vote Lib Dem? NHS and health, again, that consistent story on top, but tactical voting far higher for the Liberal Democrats than any other party. And then the local candidate there at 24%. And the one thing I will say is, from our focus groups, there is no doubt that Lib Dem campaigners did an amazing job of increasing the name recognition of their candidates in their target seats. Nowhere else with no other party would people be able to talk about the Lib Dem challenger, or, well, I guess the challenger. But in Lib Dem target seats, the name came up repeatedly. So clearly that had an impact. And it was interesting when we would do the focus groups with usually former Tory voters voting Liberal Democrat. The main reason that they would give for switching was this sense the Lib Dems were just a bit more normal now than the Conservatives, that they'd always voted Conservatives because Conservatives, did politics quietly. They got on with the job. They managed the economy reasonably well. They were just sort of broadly competent and sensible, and they'd lost that. And as one woman said, they become a bit weird recently. And the Lib Dems, I think, benefited a huge amount from that sense that, yeah, as I say, they were just more kind of mainstream than the Conservatives have become. And I think, again, that is a lesson for the Conservatives as they think about the path to rebuilding. Let's move on to Reform UK. Interestingly, slightly younger than the average Conservative. So a white 55-year-old man who voted Leave, probably lives in a village and didn't go to university, and much more of an educational skew here. And you can see that 2/3 of the Reform vote was former Conservative voters. But a note of caution on that before people try just stacking up the two votes. I'll talk about that in a second. Took some Labour votes, not many. Obviously, Brexit Party votes, as you would expect. But the really interesting thing, and why we are seeing Nigel Farage and Richard Tice talk so much about the electoral system, is that the distribution of Reform votes was very even. But of course, the counter to that is it was very inefficient, which meant that they got, pretty consistent vote share across the country, but only enough to win in 5 seats. And you compare that to the Liberal Democrats, who, of course, got fewer votes overall. They're much more efficient and variable distribution, and similarly with the Green Party as well. And there is a clear effect here when you look at Brexit vote. I think there clearly has been some Brexit de-alignment in this election, because if you look at the Conservative vote, essentially, the relationship has diminished, but there is still a strong relationship there for Reform UK. So Reform very much having the mantle of the Brexit Party. And again, what is striking about Reform is, when we looked at reasons for voting for other parties, there tended to be a few bunched around 30% to sort of 20% in the top three. For Reform UK, it's not that. It is immigration overwhelmingly at 72%. It was Reform UK was, for many people, immigration was the be and the end all, combined with the fact that people would say in focus groups that Nigel Farage sort of says it like it is. He's authentic. He's different to other politicians. There is no doubt that is part of the appeal and something for other parties to reflect on in the future. How do you capture the authenticity which people clearly like from more populist parties without necessarily mimicking them? The flip side, though, that I would say is there is no doubt that Reform lowered their own ceiling during the last few days, week or so of the campaign, with comments about Ukraine and racism amongst Reform UK candidates. We'll be digging into this a bit more next week, but there were very clearly a group of voters who might have been prepared to opt for them, but they just recoiled when they heard those comments about Ukraine and those comments from Reform activists. And it's clearly one of the big challenges that Nigel Farage faces. What about the Green Party? Well, a highly effective vote distribution in the 4 seats that they were targeting, although it is interesting that the Greens may have left themselves with something of a conundrum going forward. And again, we want to warn this in that they are now second place to Labour in 39 seats, and clearly the main challengers in those seats for the kind of progressive urban vote. But 2 of their gains in this election, North Herefordshire and Waveney Valley, were very different profiles of seats to that. And it will be interesting to see if the Greens can keep that coalition together, these sort of more rural Conservative seats, when, in future they are going to want to be targeting, certainly if they want to make gains against Labour, lots of inner city seats. And of course, a significant chunk of the public didn't vote at all. In fact, non-voters scored more highly than any of the parties. This was a low turnout election, 60% nationally, Wales and Scotland, an even larger fall there, an enormous 60 constituencies. Turnout was under 50%. Conservative 2019 voters more likely to vote again this time around than Labour ones, but also make up a bigger chunk of those who decided not to vote as well. So if you look at non-voters, one of the best ways to predict who is a non-voter is people who didn't vote previously, and that held at this election, but also 19% of 2019 Conservatives, 17% of 2019 Labour voters, and lots of young people as well. And you can see from that map where those non-voters were distributed. Again, as with the parties, who is the typical non-voter? Someone in their 40s, usually with no qualifications beyond school, so the lowest level of formal education of the groups we've talked about, tends to rent and live in a small town, and particularly struggle with the cost of living. So where does that leave us? Well, I want to do 7 stories that define this election. We know that the electorate has become increasingly volatile, and that is a pattern that persisted in this election. You saw Labour winning in areas that they'd never been competitive before, but also they suffered shock losses, places like Leicester South, people like West Streeting almost being defeated in what you'd have assumed would have been safer seats, and big Conservative majorities, as you can see here, were no defence against Reform UK, and the Liberal Democrats holding all of those by-election gains. So we are in an era where the safe seat, the average safe seat, is nowhere near as safe as it was in the past. And we have many more marginal seats. What about education? There was much discussion post-Brexit and what was happening in the US, that education was becoming a new cleavage in politics. And I think you can see that persists here, whilst amongst the Conservatives, the relationship is relatively flat, and Labour too. That is in large part because Labour won in so many areas and the Conservatives lost votes, particularly amongst those without a degree who had voted for them in 2019. The smaller parties exemplify that pattern. So the Green Party there and the Liberal Democrats much more likely to be voted for by graduates. Reform UK, the opposite pattern is there. And just continuing on that theme of third parties, what you can see is the extent to which Conservative losses are much more driven by the rise of third parties than distinct movement to Labour. Labour gains driven by third parties splitting the votes, whilst independent candidates also act as a pull on Labour, denting their vote share. But one clear exception is Scotland, where there was that very clear swing to Labour. And Scotland is a really important story of this election. You know, the SNP losing 39 seats, as dramatic as what happened when they won 50 at the 2015 election. You know, the SNP to Labour swing was really big, and shaped both by an SNP collapse, but also a really significant Labour overperformance. And I think this map is one of the most striking of the election, which were the seats where Labour really overperformed. And you can see the clear preponderance of them in Scotland there, and in particular around the central belt, which is now reliably Labour. The flip side For Labour, of course, were those seats where they lost votes, and there is no doubt there was a clear relationship between the number of Muslim voters in a seat and the swing against Labour, or the fall in the Labour vote share. And you can see that very clearly on this graph here, that there was a Gaza effect in this election. But as I've said, I think it is wrong to think of Gaza as the sole reason for these seats and Muslim voters moving away from Labour. I think the more apt comparison is with Brexit and the Red Wall, where Brexit acted as a trigger for something deeper that led to voters moving away from Labour. I think Gaza is similar, and it is striking. You hear similar things when you talk to Muslim voters in these seats, as you would have heard in 2019 when you spoke to formerly Labour voting voters in the Red Wall. This sense that they feel neglected by the Labour Party, taken for granted, that their local area is suffering, that they voting for independence because they're going to act as a champion for their area. There is clearly something deeper going on. And as I say, I think the two effects, the Brexit unanchoring and the Gaza unanchoring, are similar in that they are the triggers for a deeper disaffection amongst normally loyal voter groups. We've talked a bit about the cost of living and the NHS. It is striking, though, how much higher than any other issue they are in terms of people saying that they had an impact on their vote. Immigration much lower, although there is still a very clear desire, and you see this here, for lower immigration. Although, again, the profile of the parties and their support is quite different. One of the interesting things about Labour winning on a relatively low vote share is that actually, slightly under half of their voters say that the government should reduce numbers of immigrants coming to the country, much higher for Conservatives and Reform UK, and as you might imagine, lowest amongst Green voters. Again, he's really interesting. We didn't talk about climate change much in this election campaign, but that doesn't mean that it didn't matter. And I think it was really striking. If you just look at Labour and Liberal Democrat voters, climate and the environment is actually the number 3 issue for them in this election. Cost of living and the NHS overwhelmingly on top, but then climate and affordable housing. There is no doubt that for the voters that drove Labour's victory and those Liberal Democrat gains, climate change matters to them. And I don't know why this is going backwards now. And in a similar way, actually, if you look at Rishi Sunak's climate reversals that he made in autumn of last year, when he made what, in my view, was that slightly strange change pivot. If you look at that, people were not very likely to say that delaying climate targets were one of Rishi Sunak's achievements, just 6%. In fact, 11% much more say they were one of his biggest mistakes. But of course, at the top of that list of mistakes, again, you see the failure to reduce waiting lists, failure to bring down channel crossings, and the cost of living. His biggest successors, furlough. There's no surprise that he talked about furlough so often, the cap on energy bills, and overseeing inflation coming down. I also find it personally quite amusing that banning XL bullies is joint 4th on his list of top achievements. We talked about reform and immigration, but actually one of the stories here again is that there is sometimes this sense that and we hear it from the continent, parties of the populist right winning on climate or anti-climate messaging. That clearly was not a driver for Reform UK. Only 4% said their policies on the environment were a driver. It is immigration first and foremost. And actually, we found consistently throughout the campaign that Great British Energy was one of the most popular of Labour's policies, including amongst voters on the right, Conservatives and Reform UK. So again, it would be wrong to say that this was a climate election by any stretch of the imagination, but there was clearly an underlying hygiene test issue on climate, which Labour and the Liberal Democrats passed, and people had some doubts about the Conservatives. So taken together, was this 1997? Well, I think clearly not. And some of the reasons that jump out for why Labour lost seats, including some very safe seats, particularly to those independents, but also seats like Leicester East, that rise of third parties. Conservatives, a very interesting pattern. The fact that they held Keighley and Stockton West, really interesting, and very little optimism there. I would very quickly, because I do want to get onto questions, just canter through some of the challenges for Labour. One of them, as we know, is that Keir Starmer does not enter Downing Street particularly popular. I don't think that is purely a Keir Starmer issue. I think it is an issue that politicians in general are less popular than they have been. But interestingly, lots of the seats that Labour won, he's not popular in, and will have his work cut out to maintain that majority. And the other challenge is that Labour finds itself somewhat surrounded on all sides. So if you look at the main challenges to the Conservatives in 2019, it was fairly clear Labour, and then to a lower extent the Liberal Democrats. Challenges to Labour in 2024, Conservatives, also Reform UK, also the Greens, also the SNP. They're going to have opposition from lots of different directions. Now, of course, having a non-fragmented opposition didn't really help the Conservatives going from 2019 to 2024. So I don't want to overplay that, but it is certainly something that they're going to have to be conscious of. And I suspect particularly will shape new MPs and how they behave. And we know as well that Labour don't have a particularly long time to start making a difference. Most people would like to see Labour make a difference between 6 months and 2 years. In particular, people who voted Labour expect to see change within a year, expect to see progress, interestingly similar from the Liberal Democrats as well. So there is going to be pressure to make change. And as we've said, the majority is much more precarious than it was. And, I think one of the things for Labour to reflect on in general, and it is not separate from what we were talking about with the bleeding of Labour votes to those Gaza independents, is that in the most deprived seats, Labour tended to see a swing against them. And I think Labour will want to think about how it delivers for more deprived communities as it embraces government and delivery. Finally, on this section, the red wall, we know that the Conservative vote share fell, as it did pretty much everywhere else, and Labour regained all but one of the red wall seats that they lost. But they're actually less popular in these seats than they were in 2019. They actually lost votes across the red wall seats. So it is not a case that the realignment just entirely disappeared. On the flip side, those Conservative losses that were so pronounced in the so-called blue wall in the south of England, and you see in these seats where the Reform UK vote went up slightly less than average, but the Liberal Democrat vote up much more than average in those blue wall seats, which is why they held just 9 of the 37 representative blue wall seats. Lib Dems gained 19, Labour took 9 of them themselves. So the other way to look at it is, they are in joint third place in the blue wall, that former Conservative bastion. And a particular interest to us at More in Common is what we called Whitby Woman. This is the group of conservative to undecided voters that we identified at the start of this year, who would be crucial to the Conservatives avoiding electoral wipeout in this election. You can see there that the Conservatives not only didn't win them back, but the swing against the Conservatives with Whitby Woman was actually greater than in the rest of the country, or I should say in Whitby Woman seats where there were the highest percentage of that group of voters, which was older female, non-university educated homeowners, normally loyal, reliably Conservative. If you look at those seats, big gains in the Reform vote, above average gain in the Labour vote, and a bigger fall in the Conservative vote. And that helps to explain why the Conservative defeat was as catastrophic as it was. That group of voters who, if they had won back, if they had persuaded to come back to what is their traditional home for voting, you would have been looking much more at the sort of 200 seat level for the Conservatives, but they failed to do that, and they particularly failed to do it during the campaign. Things like D-Day, Gamblegate, what ultimately meant that this type of voter decided that they weren't going to go home to the Conservatives, and I think that's something the Conservatives will have to own as they think about building back. Just on that point about building back, why did the Conservatives lose? This isn't a perfect question, but I think the scale of it is useful in showing you that this wasn't an ideological issue. This wasn't people thinking they were too right-wing or too left-wing. Slightly more Reform UK voters say they were too left-wing. Overall, slightly more voters say right-wing. But overwhelmingly, it is a feeling that the Conservatives weren't competent. This was an election which was lost on valence issues, trust, competence, delivery, connection with the country, rather than a particular ideological wing of the Conservative Party. And linked to that, there is already some analysis saying, oh, if only the Conservatives had been more right-wing, or they had done a deal with Reform UK, they would have been better. I've seen some truly terrible analysis, just adding up the Conservative and Reform UK vote and saying, oh, look, it's higher than Labour. Actually, when you ask Reform UK voters, who might you have voted for, who you sort of considering voting for, only 36% said the Conservatives. Actually, if you look at that, it does not imply major gains, not least as 16% said they might have considered voting Labour. So the net advantage in the absence of reform is not significant. On the flip side, if you look at Conservatives, only 3 in 10 said that they thought about voting Reform UK. More actually would have considered voting in aggregate for the parties of the left, Greens, Lib Dems, and Labour, which suggests not only might the Conservatives not gain that much through an alliance with Reform UK, but also they would risk losing votes on their left flank. So I think the challenge for the Conservatives is going to be, how do you, certainly they need to appeal to some Reform UK voters, but again, doing so on things like trust, competence, delivery, rather than aping Nigel Farage, which we know would alienate lots of Conservative voters and wouldn't necessarily bring over Reform UK voters. As I mentioned earlier, the Midlands are now a significant part of the Conservative coalition, more so than they have been ever before. And it, despite the sort of ebb and flow, there is this trend towards the Conservatives becoming more of a Midlands party. I've shown this before, but just very quickly, we asked before the election, who do you think is responsible for the Conservatives' loss in terms of the 3 prime ministers? Interestingly, Conservative and Lib Dem voters, quick to say it's Liz Truss there, whereas for Labour and Reform UK voters, much more likely to say that it was Rishi Sunak's action. So again, I think a bit of a challenge in the post-mortem that there's a bit of a split decision there. But I think one of the things which they can certainly learn from is those areas where the Conservatives overperformed in this election. And one of them very clearly was Tees Valley, where Ben Houchen's brand of conservatism was clearly very popular. He was re-elected against the odds, and there were lower swings against the party, and also in Scotland, in part benefiting from the SNP's collapse. And that is where I will stop. There was a lot of data there, so we will make sure that is up on the website, but we have a little bit of time for me to canter through some questions.
Yes, we don't we have about 10 minutes. As Luke says, we'll put all the slides on the website as soon as possible. I'll rattle through questions in the order they came in on. And the first one's from Adam Ellison, who asked, can you summarise for us the shift in Scotland? Why have Labour done so well, and what does this mean for the future of Scotland?
It's good, very good question. Quickly, I would say that the SNP are in some ways the victims of their own success. They previously managed to win by winning everywhere on quite an even vote share. And when that swings against you, it means that the seats topple down quite quickly again as well. It may be the same problem that Labour face in the future with their quite precarious majorities. But I think the other big thing is, when we do focus groups, two big drivers of the swing against the SNP. One, falling salience of independence, not falling support for independence, falling salience of independence. And secondly, SNP scandals have contributed to that time for change mood being just as strong in Scotland.
Next question. I'm going to combine two questions, if I may, from Keith Raffin and Oliver Moole. Keith asks, isn't our first past the post electoral system now under unprecedented strain, with the new Labour government winning 2/3 of the seats on 1/3 of those who voted? That's apart from the combined Tory Labour share of the vote. Another such disproportionate result in 2029 will surely bring overwhelming demand for proportional representation. And to add to that same theme from Oliver Moore, will Labour government answer the inevitable calls to change the FTP system during this parliament? So putting those two together, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to try and guess what Labour might do, but there is no doubt this was a very, very disproportional election. I don't think that is the same as saying it's not the result people wanted, because I think clearly what caused some of the splintering towards smaller parties in the end was a sense that Labour were going to win anyway. But there is no doubt Reform UK are going to keep up this campaign against the electoral system. I guess the point that I just make, which is a standard problem, right, is it is never going to be in the interests of the party in government, who tend to be the party who benefit from that disproportionality, to change the system. So you're always going to have that sort of catch-22 that, why would Labour change a system which gave them this big majority and would have only given them, if you use pure PR, 1/3 of the seats on a PR system?
Okay. Next question is from Lewis Stevens. To what extent were unprecedented events, pandemic, Partygate, Liz Truss, etc., during the previous parliament responsible for the electorate's volatility? Can the effects of these events be isolated from wider trends that have affected the outcome?
It's difficult to isolate them. There is no doubt that if you look at the sort of fall in the Conservative vote share on voting intention polls, that there are moments like Partygate and the mini budget where it sort of dips, but there is also a fairly consistent sort of drip down throughout the parliament, with the exception of the vaccine bounce. So I think it's probably fair to see those events more again as triggers which maybe exaggerated or hastened the decline, rather than being solely responsible. I think electoral volatility, though, is actually a separate issue. I just think it is a case of we have an electorate now which just doesn't have traditional loyalties in the same way, and is very willing to switch its vote.
Another question from Keith Raffin. Are Reform's second places primarily in Labour seats? Hence Farage's comment about now going after the Labour vote.
I think they are, but that is largely because Labour have so many seats. I actually don't know what it is. Well, I have to get back to you on what it is proportionally. But yes, there is no doubt there's that whole swathe of seats, particularly, what were the sort of seats in the northeast of England and around where Reform UK are the main challengers to Labour. And look, I think there is no doubt now, and it's slightly frustrating that voter recall isn't always good enough for us to go back this far. But I think there is no doubt that yes, Reform took, as you saw, overwhelmingly its vote from 2019 Conservatives, but some, and I think a reasonably large proportion of those 2019 Conservatives had voted Labour at some point 2010 to 2019. I think they took disaffected, de-anchored former Labour voters too.
Okay, we're really up against it. The clock is ticking. We have actually only 3 minutes left. So this has to be the final question live, and we can get to the other questions by typing answers. So a question here from Catherine Walker will go to, do you think the Lib Dems will struggle with a base that features so many tactical voters rather than passionate Liberal Democrat converts?
Maybe, and if the Conservative Party become, as I said, sort of, in the eyes of those voters, more normal again, those seats could fall quite quickly. The counter I would give to that, though, is that the experience, sort of 1992 to 2010, was when Lib Dem MPs become dug in. They normally are able to hold on in quite difficult circumstances otherwise. So, they are normally good constituency champions, and I can't see a reason for that changing either. If I may, Angus, I'm just going to go to Tom Calver's election, who asked, why do you think this election was so hard to poll? I think it's a really interesting question. And look, there is no, in some ways, lots of it was called right. I mean, the MRPs were broadly on point. I mean, ours wasn't far off on the Conservative or Labour vote share. In terms of the Conservative Reform Lib Dem vote share, the polling was pretty accurate on them. The big challenge was the Labour vote, which I think everyone overestimated there, sometimes quite significantly. And I think that was a couple of things, and we're going to be, doing our own kind of post-mortem into that. But the things which jump out at me are, one, that swing to the Gaza independence. I don't think polling panels are doing a good enough job at getting representative samples of minority ethnic voters, is number one. So we're missing that. Number two, I do think there was a late swing as people felt more comfortable voting for the Greens and other parties, which is obviously really hard to pick up in polling as well. And then I think in some cases there was an over-engagement problem with online panels, which meant that Reform's vote looked higher than it actually ended up being.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke. It's 5 to 12. We'll have to call a halt, unfortunately, because we could go on a lot longer. The unanswered questions we'll try to type answers for, plus the slides and everything Luke has presented will go up on the website shortly. And then just a quick reminder, there'll be a full report next week and another mega poll, which will dig even deeper into some of the findings that Luke's been talking about. But above all, it's a big thank you to everyone who's attended this webinar today. Thank you for sparing the time and for listening in to what Luke had to say. Once again, a lot of fascinating data and findings really helped me, certainly speaking for myself, get into some explanations for what happens and looking ahead to the challenges for the new government and the Conservative Party rebuild. So thank you very much for joining, and see you again soon.